everyone. Pleasure being with you on another one of these winter days that we seem to be experiencing this year. I do have faith that it will eventually end. Wheat quality, and this issue came up with some questions that I got last fall, primarily from Heather. She was getting questions about the impact of the changeover to the use of fall nitrogen on wheat and the use of the fall soil nitrate test. And some growers were concerned that this could possibly have an impact upon the quality of wheat. So from that, talking with Dr. Steinhuber and with Heather some more, we decided that it might be a good opportunity to just have a presentation about wheat quality in general and then focus on some of the impacts of soil fertility and environmental factors that are associated with wheat quality. So we will go ahead and get started. The session this afternoon is going to include a definition of soft red winter wheat quality. We're going to identify some of those characteristics, quality characteristics, those that are important to the industry and the ones that are important to farmers. The influences on wheat quality, and of course there's multiple factors that influence wheat quality. Genetics plays a large role. The environment, and primarily the weather in that situation, is a major factor, as is soil fertility. And we'll just talk a little bit about how much influence soil fertility has on wheat quality. And then the last part of this presentation is going to be a discussion about the different nutrients, the macros and the micros, and what their role is in wheat production in general, and if they have any influence on quality. As you can see from this flow chart, wheat quality is different things to different individuals that are chains in the link. The wheat breeder is really the one that has, there it is, wheat breeder up here, which you probably saw. Anyway, the wheat breeder up there on the top left really has the biggest challenge because all the links flow below the breeder, all the way down to the consumer. And of course, when you have that many links, you can imagine that there are different demands for quality with each link in the chain. Our focus this afternoon will be primarily upon the farmer's position regarding wheat quality. Of course, we have 6 wheat classes in the U.S. Quality is somewhat different for each, and some of that quality is in their names. You got hard wheats versus soft wheats. You have red wheats versus white wheats. Wheat classification is primarily a function of the genetics that makes the wheat hard, that makes it red, and in addition, the climate to a certain extent. Of course, we're in the East. We grow soft red winter wheats. That does not mean that you can't take a hard red winter wheat and produce it here. And in fact, a number of years ago, I did some research looking at the performance of hard red winter wheats in this region, and Virginia Tech even has a program developing hard red winter wheats for this region, and they will perform fine. What is wheat quality? Industry definition, the overall industry definition for wheat quality is the suitability of the flour for end-use products. That's the best definition to describe wheat quality from an industry perspective. Of course, since we have so many chains in that link, you can obviously see that wheat quality is not one single property. And in fact, it's a function of the milling, the chemical, the baking and processing, as well as the physical characteristics of the wheat. Are all of these important to a farmer? That's the question we want to try to provide some answers for this afternoon. Probably the quality characteristic that best defines milling quality is flour yield. Now, flower yield is very much genetically controlled. Environment does have an influence on it. The weather. If it's too dry, you have drought, you have a poor crop, you have shrunken kernels, you're obviously not going to have the flower yield that you would want. Or if you have a disease outbreak, that's another problem that can definitely affect flower yield. Now, soft red winter wheat, flower yield is typically between 74 and 80%. Break flower, which is just below that, and for those of you that are unfamiliar with what break flower is, it's the first flower that comes off the first rolls in a mill. And it's usually the finest granulation flour and is really in very high demand, particularly for soft red winter wheat. It functions very well for some of the products that are made with soft red winter wheat flour. Typically that flour yield is about 30 to 34%. So in other words, you get about almost half of your flour in soft red winter wheat comes off as break flour. Soil fertility has no role as long as you have no nutrient deficiencies for the crop. Soil fertility will not change the amount of flower yield you're going to have. That is primarily genetically controlled. Soft red winter wheat milling quality, another characteristic is protein. Protein is influenced by genetics, the environment, and it can be influenced by fertility and primarily by the nutrient nitrogen. That research I did a number of years ago with hard red winter wheats, one of the things we discovered is you can enhance the protein amount of hard red winter wheat with a late application, and by late it's an application at booting or shortly after the crop heads. Shot of nitrogen at that point in time will increase the protein content of the wheat. Now, soft red winter wheat has lower protein content than hard red winter wheat. Runs about 7 to 11% for the soft red wheats, 12 to 16% for the high red wheats. And in addition, the hard red wheats have a high gluten content, or that's one of the quality characteristics that is very much in demand. We do not receive any premiums for high protein soft red winter wheat. We can enhance it with a late application of nitrogen, but if there's no protein offered for it, does it really matter if we do it? Let's shift a little right now to the baking quality characteristics, and there are many end-use products with soft red winter wheat. We're going to describe 3 categories of those products. The way the mills meet the flour or provide the flour for the various end users is with specs that are given to them by the end users. And of course, you can imagine these vary depending upon which product the end user is making. Chemically leavened products, those that use baking powder as their leavening agent, primarily cakes and cookies. These are products that are rich in sugars and fats. Tenderness is very important. That's one of the reasons why soft red wheat flour is desirable for these products. 2 of the most important characteristics are the water absorption of the flour, because cake size is important, and cookie spread. Cookie spread, not necessarily important for the homemaker who's baking chocolate chip cookies for kids, because the bigger the cookie, the happier the kids will be. But if you are in the packing industry, like Keebler's, baking cookies, and you have packaging that is pre-sized for automatic packaging of the cookies, then cookie spread makes a huge difference. This quality characteristic is primarily controlled by genetics. There is some environmental influence, and that has to do with primarily the cookie spread concern, or cake size as well. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. It's in reference to the alpha amylase activity that occurs. And as far as this characteristic, fertility has no role. The yeast leavened products, these are the pretzels and the crackers that are on the market. These are characterized by low sugar and fats. Again, tenderness is important. In this case, consistency in flour protein is very important, and they prefer lower protein rather than high protein. Again, one of the primary reasons why soft red winter wheat flour is used. In addition, they do not want any starch damage, and starch damage is related to, again, amylase activity. That's an environmental influence, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a little bit. Primarily under the control of genetics, environment has an influence. Fertility has no role for this. And now the non-baked products, and these we're referring to the batters and the noodles that are made from soft red winter wheat flour. For batters, low protein wheat, weak gluten content, low amylase activity, and we'll get to that in just a second. I've mentioned this amylase activity a few times. For noodles, protein is a little bit more important, and they want a little bit more gluten in it. So actually what happens for those makers of noodles is they will do a blend of soft red flour with the hard red flour to meet that gluten concentration that is desired. Intermediate water absorption, but they want rapid water uptake because they want to be able to mix their batters in a very short time. And again, the fine granulation of flour, which because of that high break flour that soft wheat has, it's a better flour for these products. Controlled by genetics, there is an environmental influence, and the environmental influence is in relation to that amylase activity. Fertility has no role. Now we're getting to a characteristic that is important to the farmer. Of course, when you go to market, the first thing that happens when you want to unload your grain at the mill is a sample is taken out of the truck. They'll probe it. They'll get the sample. They want to know what the moisture content is. That's the first characteristic they measure. And then they also look at foreign material, shrunken and broken kernels, and if there's any defects in the wheat. And by defects, I'm referring to things like whether there's any insect damage, or more importantly, what they're looking for is if there's any sprouted wheat. Now, the influences on these characteristics are non-fertility production practices. Foreign material obviously refers to, did you have a clean field, which goes back to your herbicide management, or your combine settings. Did you get too much chaff in it? Did you get too many broken pieces of straw mixed in with your grain? The shrunken and broken kernels are in reference to primarily to weather issues, at least the shrunken kernels. You have a drought, you can have a lot of shrunken kernels in your grain. Or if you have a season where you have a scab outbreak, and again, you'll have shrunken and those tombstone kernels, which we'll talk about further in this presentation. Broken kernels refer back to your combine settings. The defects, and particularly pre-harvest sprouting, is a weather-influenced characteristic. And the other characteristic they measure is test weight. And of course, test weight, depending upon what your test weight is, your wheat will be described as US number 1 all the way down to US number 5 or sample grade. And weather can have definitely an influence upon what the test weight of the crop is. And we'll talk more about what influences test weight in a bit. All right, so what is the major impact or major influencer on test weight? Here we have the 2013 Maryland variety trials. I selected 5 of the varieties that were tested. You can see we have a range of yield in those 5 varieties, which obviously tells you genetics has a large role in the performance as far as yield is concerned. And we also have varying test weights for these wheats. We have a high-yielding wheat that has sort of an intermediate test weight, 56.6. We have a low-yielding variety that has a high test weight. And we have a couple of varieties that are sort of a little below the best-yielding variety in the test, but both have what would be considered very good test weights. And the message from this slide is when you're choosing varieties, choose varieties that yield well, but don't make that your only criteria. Also look at the test weight. So choose varieties that are in that upper tier of performance that also have very good test weight. Now, environment has a huge influence on test weight, and to describe what environment can do, we're going to refer to the 2006 harvest season. That was a year when between June 24 and July 8 there was 6 to 9 inches of rainfall. Rainfall at that time of the year obviously interrupts the harvest season. We had a similar type season like that last year. Now, at the Ellen location there in the center column, let's see, get my pointer down there, yeah, the center column, that wheat was harvested before the rain events occurred. And you can see there was good test weights for the most part. You can see the genetic influence amongst the different varieties there. Had a variety at 62.6 and one that was down at 57.8. So genetics plays a large role in what test weight is for a variety. Now, if you look at the right column, the Clarksville column, Clarksville was harvested after July 8th that year, had the various rain events on it. You can see the decline in test weight that occurred between the wheat harvested at Ellen and what was actually what the test weight was for the wheat harvested at Clarksville. The amount of drop varies quite a bit. A couple of the varieties there, Tribute and SS560, had drops of only 2 to 3 pounds. You also had a variety, SS520, that had a test weight drop of 6 pounds. This is the primary reason, this change in test weight that occurs because of rain events, that I recommend farmers select varieties that have high test weight, because typically a high test weight wheat will not drop as much. If it loses 4 pounds and it was a 60-pound wheat, it's going to be at 56. If you start out with a 56-pound wheat and you lose that same 4 pounds per bushel, you're going to be at a 52-pound test weight, and you might incur some penalties for a lower test weight wheat like that. Fertility had no influence on the test weight in this particular year, primarily because this was at the end of the season. It was the result of weather events that caused the test weight to decline. So what is test weight exactly? Well, I'm sure you're all aware that it is the weight in a given volume. We use pounds per bushel. A bushel is actually 32 quarts. There are two characteristics that define test weight. You have kernel density, the weight of each individual kernel, and then you have the packing efficiency. Packing efficiency, you might be asking, what is packing efficiency? Well, believe it or not all wheat kernels are shaped the same. Some can have more deformities than others. That, in most cases, is a result of genetics. They might be more angular. Some are more ovate and pack really well. So it's this packing efficiency, the number of kernels that you can actually pack into the test weight container, right there, number of kernels that you get plus the weight of each individual kernel that determines test weight. Reduction in that packing efficiency is what usually causes the lower test weight. So what causes this packing efficiency to change? Well, one of the things that can happen is weather, and it's usually the primary factor. If you've gotten to, the crop is harvest mature, you're ready to go, and then you have weather events that keep you from getting to the field. So how do these rain events change test weight? Well, when rainfall occurs, the kernels have reached harvest maturity. What they will do is imbibe the water. And we're not talking about the thunderstorm type events that then the sun comes out and dries the field up. We're talking about those events that go on for 2, 3, 4, 5 days. You have very humid conditions. It's cloudy, it's overcast. It might rain a little bit every day, and the field just never gets ready to harvest. So these kernels are imbibing the water, and they start to swell. As they swell, the packing efficiency will go down. They get bigger, and even though you get dry weather and bring the grain down to harvest moisture again, they never shrink back to that original size they had before the rain events occurred. So what happens is you get less kernels in the test weight container, and the test weight drops. This chart that you see in the lower left there just describes a number of rain events that occurred over a particular season and the measurement of test weight as those rain events occurred. And as you can see, as the rain events occurred, the test weight declined. What really is of greatest concern, though, when you have a test weight decline across the region in any particular year, and this is concern that is expressed by the mills, is they are wondering whether that wheat seed is actually germinated. What happens when the wheat germinates? Well, what happens is falling number changes, and you might be wondering at this point in time, what is falling number? Falling number is actually the viscosity of a slurry of water and ground wheat that has been heated. And they'll actually put this into a column, and then they'll drop a stirring rod down through that column, and falling number indicates how long it takes that rod to drop down through that column of the mixture of flour and water. The faster it goes, the lower the falling number is. High falling numbers is what is desirable. Low falling numbers indicates that there's been a considerable amount of the flour changed over to sugar, and that's going to affect products that are made from that particular wheat. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, when you have low test weight starting to show up across a region in any particular season, mills start asking themselves, are we going to have a quality problem that exists because of a starch issue? Kind of done that already. So what happens when wheat sprouts? In order to best describe that, let's look at a kernel of wheat. Of course, you've got three components. You've got the bran or the seed coat, you've got the germ area, and then you've got what is the primary component of a kernel. That's the wheat endosperm, or which is actually the flour of the wheat. Now, what is the endosperm of the flour? In this chart right here, it's starch. And what is starch? Starch is just glucose molecules that are hooked together in long chains. So, you get rain events, you get imbibition of water. This imbibition of water triggers the release of an enzyme. This enzyme is alpha amylase. Now, alpha amylase is an enzyme that cleaves starch into sugar molecules, and it almost can be thought of as like a little pair of scissors that wants to cleave the bonds between the glucose molecules, and wants it to turn it into sugar because the seed is imbibed. The plant is thinking that I want to germinate. I've got to feed my seedling, and the feed for that seedling is sugar until it emerges and is able to produce its own sugar through photosynthesis. So it's sugar to feed the germinating seedling. Now, when this happens, flour baking properties are affected. The soil fertility influence falling number? It has no influence whatsoever on falling number. Let's look again at 2006, and again, this is the year we had 6 to 9 inches of rain from the beginning of harvest season to the end of harvest season. We've got 3 locations: Poplar Hill, which was harvested prior to the rain events; Kittiesville, which actually there was an opportunity to harvest there sort of in the middle of those rain events that year; and then the Y, which was harvested after all the rain events had occurred. McCormick is a variety that there was very little change in falling number. And this can happen. The primary reason this happens is because McCormick is a variety that has a relatively long dormancy period once it reaches harvest maturity. On the other end of the spectrum is the variety there at the bottom of those 4, and that's this USG variety. It had high falling number at the start of the season, but by the time it was harvested after all the rain events, it had very low falling number. In this case, genetics has a large role in the amount of dormancy that each variety has. The environment is really the initiator of the process. Some varieties are going to respond to it. Those varieties that have very little dormancy will germinate very quickly, and those are the varieties that are then going to have huge changes in falling number occur. Fertility in this case has no influence upon falling number values. All right, we'll shift gears now and talk about another impact on quality, and this is disease. And the disease is probably the one that we're the most concerned about in this region. That's Fusarium head blight or head scab. Of course, you probably all have seen it. It's those years when we have those bleach spikes or spikelets. You have that pink to salmon colored spore masses on the glooms. The reason this is of such great concern is because when you have a scab outbreak, you have the opportunity for the development of vomitoxins. And many of you probably have heard about DON or deoxynivalenol, whatever it is. It's a rather long scientific name for it. The reason DON is a concern is because mills will only accept wheat that has up to 1 part per million DON in the flour. Some years they will accept it a little higher. The reason they will take it a little higher is because they in those years feel they have enough good flour to blend with the affected flour that they can bring it down to the 1 part per million level, which is acceptable. All right, so what influences scab severity? Well, first you have to have a susceptible host, and we have multiple susceptible hosts in this region. Wheat is definitely susceptible, as is corn, barley, oats, and a lot of the grasses that we grow. As far as wheat is concerned, all varieties have some level of susceptibility, which is controlled by genetics. There is some tolerance getting bred into some of the varieties, but there are no varieties that are considered 100% resistant. Come on. There we go. You have to have the pathogen present, and because we have so many hosts, we have plenty of the pathogen available at all times, and the pathogen will overwinter on the host plant residue. And the environment plays a huge role. In this case, the infection period is actually a rather narrow window, and it's a window that has rainy, humid periods just before, during, and after flowering. It can be as little as probably 6 days to maybe at the most 7 days, or a 10-day period of time that the crop will be susceptible. And again, soil fertility has no influence on the amount of disease that may occur in any particular year. All right, we've covered a couple of problems that can affect quality. Scab, falling number problems. What is the best practice for minimizing both of these problems? And I think this is about the only option you have available to you. Pray for favorable weather during wheat flowering, and also pray for favorable weather during wheat harvest. If you can get through both of those periods of time with good growing conditions, good dry weather at flowering, good dry weather during harvest, chances are you're going to have a crop of wheat that will have good quality. All right, we'll shift gears a little bit. And now we're going to talk about the role of soil fertility, both in regards to wheat production and wheat quality. Of course, we all know that you need sunlight, you need water, and you need air. And from the air, you get carbon dioxide for the plant so it can photosynthesize. The water in the soil is going to help move the nutrients into the plant. And as long as you have adequate nutrition or fertility, the plant will be all it can be. However, there are times you have deficiencies, and you can run into instances where you have toxicities as well. Liebig's law of the minimum best describes which nutrient is going to be the limiting factor, and it's the one that is the most deficient that will determine the performance of the crop. And as far as the toxicity is concerned, this can also have an impact upon the plant growth and quality of the crop. We'll talk about the 6 macronutrients, the primaries, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. We'll talk a little bit about the plant function for each of those, the secondary macronutrients, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. In addition, we'll talk about 6 of the micronutrients and their plant functions. Now, if you think you have a nutrient disorder, the best thing that you can do if you're trying to diagnose the problem is compare normal plants, if you can find some in a field that is showing deficient problems, and generally you can, and you want to compare those with plants that are showing the problem. You also want to examine new leaves and older leaves, because depending upon what kind of deficiency you have present, it will be characteristic in either new leaves or older leaves. Old leaf deficiencies describe mobile nutrients, those that can move from one place to another. If it's a deficiency you primarily see on new leaves, it's an immobile nutrient, or one that does not readily move. The mobile nutrients, those that you'll see by examining old leaves, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the big 3, magnesium, and chloride. As far as the immobile nutrients, and here we've got more of the micros and some of the secondary macros, but sulfur, calcium, iron, zinc, copper, boron, and manganese. Of course, pH is very important regarding fertility. It can determine whether you have a deficiency present or whether you have a potential for a toxic condition. For wheat, the optimum pH is between 6 and 7. For the most part, as long as you're staying on top of what your soil test pH levels are and you're adding lime periodically, you won't have a problem with your pH situation. We'll start with the big one, nitrogen. Nitrogen is a mobile nutrient, so in order to identify nitrogen, you want to look at those old leaves. Characteristic for nitrogen deficiency is that that V-shaped yellowing that you will see on the older leaves, starting from the tip and then working back towards the base of the plant. Nitrogen is important because it's found in every one of the amino acids. Of course, amino acids are the building blocks of the proteins, and the proteins are the building blocks of our plants. So it's a highly important nutrient. What effect on quality can it have? Well, if you're slightly deficient in nitrogen, it can lower your protein. More importantly, though, if you're deficient in nitrogen, you will have less yield. Conditions favoring nitrogen deficiency, and I'm sure you're all aware of it, soil type plays a huge role, as well as amount of moisture present. Too much, too little moisture can have a big effect on how much nitrogen is present. And excess nitrogen can also cause problems. You've all seen fields that look like this, I'm sure. We don't see nearly as many of those as we did probably 20, 25 years ago. I think that's primarily because we have much better nitrogen management than we may have had 20, 25 years ago. Too much nitrogen will have an effect on quality. It will lower test weight, and that's primarily because lodged plants will not fill the grain as well as plants that are not lodged. It also provides a better disease environment. Phosphorus. Highlighted by leaf purpling, it's a mobile nutrient, so you want to look at those oldest leaves. Typically this is, if you're deficient in nitrogen, you're typically going to see this during the early vegetative growth stages of a crop. Often because the root growth isn't quite enough at that point in time to get access to the phosphorus, move it into the plant, and and you will frequently then see phosphorus deficiency occur if you're in a deficient situation. If you pull up the plants, you'll often see stunted root growth. Phosphorus is important because it comprises, it's one of the elements in the nucleic acids, our DNA and RNA, and it also functions in ATP, which is the powerhouse of cellular activity. Through phosphorylation and the breaking of a phosphorus bond, there's energy released within a cell, and that energy then allows the cell to do whatever chemical reactions are required so that it can continue to grow. Conditions favoring phosphorus deficiency: those cold soils, either too wet or too dry early in the season, phosphorus that's out of the root zone, compacted soils where you have restricted root growth can have an impact on it, as can injured roots. Potassium, this is another one of the mobile nutrients. Frequently, if you're looking at it with a pickup truck survey, as you drive by, potassium will look a lot like a nitrogen deficiency because you'll have that chlorotic appearance across the field. However, in this case, if you examine the leaves and you look at the older leaves, you want to look for chlorotic or necrosis on the leaf margins rather than that V shape back towards the base of the leaf that is characteristic of nitrogen. You look at the edges of the leaves for the chlorosis and the necrosis to occur. Potassium plays a role in ion transport, moving ions between the cells. In addition, it works as a catalyst for some of the reactions. Excess potassium may cause deficiencies in calcium and magnesium. Again, conditions that favor a deficiency related to the soil types we have. Sandier soils will be more prone than less sandy soils. Weathered soils are more prone, whether it's too wet, too dry, high organic matter soils. If you have limited early growth, cool conditions early in the season will limit the growth and possibly limit your potassium uptake. One of the other things to pay particular importance to regarding potash, if you had heavy removal by your preceding crop, if you had a good corn crop or a good soybean crop before you plant your small grains, and you were sort of on the mid-level for potassium availability per your previous soil test, you may want to consider a potassium addition in the fall before you plant your wheat, because that crop, if it was a real good crop, will have removed considerable amount of the potassium. Sulfur. Sulfur is an immobile nutrient. As you can see from the picture on the left, if you're doing a roadside survey, it will look very much like a nitrogen deficiency, possibly a potassium deficiency. In this case, however, you're looking at the younger leaves. Because it's an immobile nutrient, the young leaves are going to show the symptoms, which you can see there in the right picture. Another indicator that you have a sulfur deficiency present is if those younger leaves don't green up with the addition of nitrogen. Sulfur is important in the two sulfur-containing amino acids, cysteine and methionine. Favorable conditions for deficiency: low pH, sandy soil, soils with very low organic matter content, and again those cold, dry soils either in the spring or in this case in the fall, which results in a delayed release from organic matter. And excess sulfur may cause premature leaf drop. Calcium, an immobile nutrient. The characteristics that best define calcium deficiency are stunted growth, stunted seedling growth, and if you pull up the plant and look at the roots, you'll see that you're not getting any root elongation, and the roots will have a tendency to remain stubby. Calcium functions in cell wall and cell membranes. It adds strength and structure to the cell walls and cell membranes. Favorable conditions for it: if you have low pH soils, less than 5. If you get pHs down that low, Most likely what you're going to see before a calcium deficiency will be aluminum toxicity, possibly manganese toxicity. And excess calcium may cause potassium or magnesium deficiency. As long as you're using a high-cal lime product and you're maintaining your pH, calcium deficiency is something you're very rarely going to see in small grains. Magnesium. This is a mobile nutrient, so you want to look at those older leaves. And here the primary characteristic is interveinal chlorosis. In some cases, you'll see this beaded streaking that's in this picture right here. It has a very important function because it is the center element in the chlorophyll molecule, which you can see right there. So it's very important to plant function. Favorable conditions for deficiency: low pH soils, sandy soils, particularly after heavy rain events, leaching the magnesium out of the root zone, and in soils that have very high potassium levels. And high plant concentrations of magnesium generally are tolerated quite well. However, it may cause calcium and potassium imbalances, and if you have a situation like that, then you're going to probably see some stunted growth occur. Boron. Boron is an immobile nutrient. This is a micronutrient that I actually witnessed firsthand a deficient situation. And what boron, the symptoms of boron, you frequently won't see them early in the season, but once the wheat heads and has gone through flowering, you start seeing wheat heads that are sterile. And that's primarily because they were not fertilized, because boron has an impact upon anther development. Another thing that you will notice will be brittle leaves with small dead spots on it. And I witnessed both the brittle leaves and many sterile heads in a field a few years back. And it was in a field where very sandy soil, low in organic matter, and it was a year where we had an intensive drought, and we weren't getting any release from the organic matter. And we were able to confirm that it was boron through both plant tissue analysis as well as soil samples that indicated the boron was the culprit that year. You can also see boron deficiencies in high pH situations, something we don't have too much concern with in this area. Excess boron causes chlorotic leaf tips, and that chlorosis will then be followed by the dying of the tissue, necrosis, and ultimately defoliation. Zinc. Zinc is an immobile nutrient, so you're going to be looking at the young leaves in this case for symptoms. The picture on the right there, you can see with zinc, without zinc, you've got stunted appearing plants. One of the characteristics in the lower left there, you can see that interveinal chlorosis, or the white band that will extend from the base to a leaf tip. That is one of the classic characteristics of zinc deficiency. Zinc functions as an enzyme activator. Favorable conditions for deficiencies: high soil pH, low organic matter soils, those cool, wet soils, again, the inability of the plant to get the nutrients, and high P soils can sometimes have zinc deficiencies. And excess zinc may cause an iron deficiency. Manganese. This is an immobile nutrient. Because it's immobile, you'll be looking at the younger leaves. In this case, the leaves will be mostly yellow, which a lot of our nutrient deficiencies are defined by that characteristic. But you'll also see dark green right next to the veins. It functions as an enzyme activator for photosynthesis. Favorable conditions: if your pH is too high, if you have sandy soils, and in this case, if you have a high organic matter content. That's almost a misnomer for sandy soils. Sludge soils frequently can have manganese deficiencies because of, especially if the pH hasn't been monitored closely in those sludge soils. An excess manganese situation, older leaves with brown spots surrounded by chlorotic zone. It will be the characteristic that you'll see. Okay, iron. Iron is an immobile nutrient. The characteristic is interveinal chlorosis. Because it's an immobile nutrient, you'll see it on the younger leaves of the plant. In this case, the leaf veins will remain green while you'll have chlorosis and probably even necrosis occur in the interveinal areas. It functions in chlorophyll synthesis, favorable conditions, high pH soils, cold, wet, poorly drained soils. Again, conditions that you've seen previously for favoring deficiencies. And excess iron, you can see that leaf there with excess written on it, may cause bronzing of leaves with tiny brown spots, almost appears probably like a disease situation. Copper. Copper is an immobile nutrient. So again, you look at the younger leaves on the plant, looks very similar to iron deficiency. It functions. It's a component of some enzymes. Favorable conditions, high organic matter soils, high pH soils, heavily sludged soils. And a copper toxicity will appear at low pH situations, affect seed germination, shoot vigor, and iron availability. Okay, chlorine. Chlorine is an immobile nutrient, so again, you look at the younger leaves. Chlorine is rarely a problem as long as you're maintaining your potassium level and you're using potash as your source of potassium. It functions in photosynthesis. Excess chlorine often appears as wilted plants associated with excess salt uptake. Okay, we've gone through 12 nutrients. Just want to summarize what we've talked about here this afternoon. In regards to wheat quality, it is primarily influenced by genetics. The environment does have a role, and by environment, I'm talking about weather, and that role can be either positive or negative. If you have positive weather conditions, you will have good quality. In some cases, if you have negative weather, poor weather, you're going to have some of the quality characteristics influenced. Soil fertility has little to no effect on the quality of wheat. Deficient pH or low pH and or nutrients will affect grain yield much, much more than it will grain quality. So you do want to pay attention to your pH. You want to pay attention to your soil fertility. You want to maintain things at optimum levels. That's primarily to produce the best crop you possibly can. If you're doing that, you'll have good grain quality. My wheat quality recommendations: choose good yielding varieties that have high test weight, and pray during flowering period and during harvest that you have favorable weather. And with that, I thank you for your attention this afternoon, and are there any questions? Let's see. Correct, okay. And the question is, please comment on Virginia Tech's research on using fall land to increase plant vigor and scavenge more nutrients. Tech has long been in favor of using fall nitrogen. However, if you think about growth and development of wheat, if you have adequate amount of nitrogen present in the fall, and that's one of the reasons why we developed the fall soil nitrate test, the wheat plant's going to grow very slowly. It germinates, seedlings are small. You hope you can develop 3 tillers by the time you go into winter dormancy, which usually doesn't occur until December or January. And the actual consumption of nitrogen that occurs during that period of time is going to be relatively small. One of the benefits we have in this region when we plant our wheat in the fall is not only do we get the residual nitrogen that we have present following, say, our corn crop or soybeans, and there's nitrogen present following soybean crop, is that we get a little bit of mineralization if we have a warmer fall. from breakdown of organic matter that also supplies the growing plant. The philosophy behind increasing plant vigor, I think, is fine. It's the reason why we had and we determined a concentration in the neighborhood of 10 parts per million as being adequate. If you're below that, then put some nitrogen out there to supply the growing crop in the fall. If you're above that, my research has indicated you have adequate amount. You're going to have adequate plant vigor, and you should be scavenging the nutrients that are available. You don't want to be in a situation where you have any limitation to nutrients. You definitely want to have soil test information that will allow you to add those nutrients if it's phosphorus or if it's potassium, at planting, so that you can take care of a situation where you might have of a deficiency, and then, of course, not having adequate amount of nitrogen will. Is it fair to say that N from soybeans is not available for fall small grains? No, not at all. In fact, I did research with and without fall nitrogen behind soybeans for about 3 years, and it didn't even matter what the fall soil nitrate test indicated we had available. We never had a situation where we had a response to fall nitrogen behind soybeans.